Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Jan, also known as Sydney Plant Guy, and I love growing large aeroids indoors. In this video, I really want to share with you my top 10 tips for beginners. These are things that I wish somebody would have told me from the beginning, so I wouldn't have had to make all of these mistakes myself, or maybe I would have learned a lesson a little bit quicker if I would have been aware of all of these things. Now, we all live in different environments. We are spread all across the world, and we all probably grow different plants. So I tried to create a top 10 list of tips that are applicable to pretty much everybody out there, irrespective of where you live, what plants you like to grow, and how far you are into your journey. Predominantly, they're really aimed at people that are just starting off their plant hobby. All right, let's get started. Tip number 1, understand your environment and select your plants accordingly. I probably say this in pretty much every video, but it is so important. I make that mistake at the beginning as well. It's very easy to get caught up and look at plants online and find plants that you want to have based on the way they look. But the problem with that is you might see somebody growing a plant in a very tropical environment and it looks beautiful, but you yourself are not quite as blessed with their tropical environment at home. So just because you like the look of their plant doesn't necessarily mean that the plant is going to like you in your environment. So it's something you can totally do, but you just need to put a lot more effort into supplementing your conditions to make it work for this particular plant, which is probably not something you want to deal with at the very beginning of your plant journey. When you start off, really, I would encourage you to understand your environment first. So understand what sort of humidity do you have to offer? How much natural light do you get? What's the temperatures? What are the fluctuations throughout the year? And then select plants accordingly. So plants that can tolerate your conditions rather than the other way around. You trying to create conditions that work for the plants that you really wanted. That way, you'll have a much easier time looking after these plants, and you can really focus on perfecting your growth approach or your care approach rather than being so focused on supplementing the environmental conditions. And then once you've got the care and the growth approach ticked off, then you can start looking at, okay, now how can I optimize my environment so I can really start getting these more finicky or tropical plants established in my environment as well. Now, how do you find out which plants suit your environment? Because everybody's environment is slightly different. Now, obviously, there is a bit of trial and error involved, and ultimately, you do just need to observe the environments, measure the humidity, measure the temperature in your environment. Really pay attention to the sun, the way the sun moves, and how much sun exposure your apartment actually gets. But ultimately, I would just also refer to people that live close by and people that already have a plant hobby and they live in your city or live in your area, live in your country. If other people are growing a particular plant without having to really supplement the conditions much, then it's probably a good sign that that's a plant that has an easy time surviving in your environment. Look at the local plant stores. If local plant stores are not stocking a particular plant, it might be because their plant isn't really suitable to the climate. I would try and get local advice first and buy the local plants, maybe even the plants that are native to your environment. And then really once you've got that care approach and you understand all about your watering, your fertilizers, your potting medium, your pest treatments and so on, then maybe, start broadening your horizon a little bit and looking at maybe supplementing humidity, supplementing light based on the types of more tropical or more challenging plants you'd like to grow. Tip number 2. Now, once you've found the plants that work for your environment and you put them in your environment, really start understanding your plants and try and form a relationship between you and your plants. Try and understand the signs the plant gives up to communicate with you. So things like leaves curling could mean that it gets either too much sun exposure, so it's trying to reduce the surface that it exposes itself to, the sun. Or it could be that it needs water, it's just curling because it's thirsty. If a plant gives you very leggy growth and the leaf size isn't really increasing, it's probably because it's not getting enough light. If it's not growing at all, it's also probably because of no light. If you see yellow spots, it could be spider mite damage. If you see a more orangey tinge on the back of a leaf, it could be thrips damage and so on. Now, depending on the species, certain things show differently. So this is not going to be a comprehensive video on all of the signs any sort of plant gives up, but I'm just saying the plants that you have chosen, really try and understand what these signs mean, so that when you expand your collection and the plants are growing bigger and bigger, that you can identify these sort of signs earlier on, so you can treat pests earlier on, you can avoid any sort of disruption to the plant or especially to new growth due to inconsistent watering and so on. So really start making these lessons from the beginning, because the earlier you understand your plants, the earlier you can make them thrive. Tip number 3, and that's pretty much with everything that you do in life or with any hobby that you have. Set yourself a goal. For sure, we all love setting ourselves a goal, and that usually keeps us motivated, but most importantly, enjoy the journey. So don't just try and chase a specific look of a plant. We're dealing with living organisms. A plant, even if you're thriving for a particular look, it's going to look like that for a couple of weeks and then it's going to change again. It also means that the goal of how you would like a plant to look is also going to continuously move. So if you're just trying to chase a goal, trust me, you'll never get there, because once you think you're there, your goal has actually expanded. Like, I mean, if we're just purely thinking about leaf size, for example, well, leaves can always get bigger, more or less always. Of course, eventually there's kind of standstill. My Monstera dubia, for example, I really wanted to grow its first fenestration. That was my goal. But by the time it had its first fenestration, I actually wanted huge, massively fenestrated leaves. I wanted every leaf to be fenestrated. Once I got there, I wanted it to grow even larger. I wanted it to grow lusher. You know, maybe have 2 plants on the same pole and so on. So the goalpost will forever move. So if you're just trying to reach the goal and you don't enjoy the journey in between, then you're going to have a hard time with this hobby. So really, really make sure that you actually enjoy the journey, enjoy every single leaf that your plant gives you, enjoy every growth, enjoy the care part as well. I love my plant chores. I don't like to call them chores. I like to call it just plant care, because that is really the part of the hobby that I enjoy. I obviously enjoy having the plants and being able to decorate my apartment with the plants, but also very much enjoy the process of growing them. Tip number 4, quality over quantity. Now, 3 years into my plant journey, I'm not purchasing that many plants, or I'm not adding that many plants to my collection anymore. That's just because I'm pretty busy with the plants that I already have. But at the very beginning of my plant journey, once you don't have a lot of plants yet, and the plants that you have are usually pretty small, it can be a little bit demotivating at the beginning. I'm a very impatient person. I understand, like, you want to get there straight away. You want to have this amazing plant collection that fills your entire apartment. All of these plants, if done correctly, will eventually grow, and then suddenly you're like, oops, I have way too many plants and not enough spots to actually give the plants the conditions that they need. Think ahead. What are all of these plants going to look like in a year's time? Can you really afford to put another 8 plants around them, or are they actually just going to compete for the good spots in the long run? So really, especially at the beginning, just stay patient. That's one really big thing that this plant hobby taught me: patience. I'm not usually a very patient person, but plants, like, you know, the plant hobby is definitely a marathon, not a sprint. In a nutshell, I highly encourage you to prioritize quality over quantity. It will make your plant journey so much more rewarding, because you're actually focusing on plants and you get the time to spend with the plants and understand them. It's also really good. Your bank account, your wallet is also going to thank you for that later. You do not need to compensate for the lack of growth by just keep adding more and more plants. That's not actually going to fix the issue of your existing plants not growing. Much rather, I think you'd be better off putting the time and effort into understanding your existing plants and growing them nicely than just keep adding more plants to the collection. Which is a good segue into the next tip. Have realistic expectations. I get quite a lot of messages from people saying, hey, I just bought plant XYZ. How long until it's the size of your plant? Now, in my plant spotlights, I do give you some sort of expected time frame, or at least the time frame that it took me to grow certain plants to maturity. Now, that is absolutely no indicator that it's going to take the same time frame for you. It could be less time, it could be way more time. It really depends on, first of all, the specimen in itself. I've grown 2 species, same mother plant. Just one plant goes absolutely crazy, the other one doesn't. Like, sometimes a specific specimen is just not really meant to survive, or like had a really bad start and just took a long time to establish itself. Whereas some others are just on fire and just go crazy straight away. So even within the same species, there can be differences. But then within different species, there can also be huge differences. And it all depends on your environment as well. If you go through really long periods of no growth, so you have really cold, long winters, of course, it's going to take you much longer than if you live in a country where you pretty much have no seasons and you just like the whole year is a growing season. So don't get too caught up about specific time frames and thinking that your plant needs to hit a certain milestone in a specific time. It's your journey, it's your plant. However long it takes, it's going to be good. So be realistic, and specifically at the beginning, I'm spending the most time actually getting a plant established in my environment, getting it happy with the conditions that I've got to offer it, getting it established in my potting medium on a moss pole. That takes a long time. But once the plant has really attached itself to the moss pole, it's used to my environment, that's when suddenly the growth really skyrockets, given the conditions are right. But that onboarding phase, let's call it onboarding, that can take a long time, and it can be really demotivating at the beginning when you get a plant and it's just not giving you what you want straight away. So be realistic with those expectations and just hang in there. Eventually, you'll get there. Next tip, stop buying potting mix. I'm referring to the store-bought potting mixes that come in huge bags and that is like just way too fine. So a couple of reasons for that. Number one, usually all of these potting mixes have a lot of fungus gnats, or at least the eggs in it, and also sometimes mold, at least from my experience. I haven't really had many good experiences with these potting mixes. They are not designed to grow aeroids indoors. They're really designed to have like potted baskets somewhere in your backyard, right? Like they're great if you want to grow veggies, for example. But for aeroids indoors, that potting mix is way too fine and does not have the best aeration. And at the same time, it's very likely that it brings any sort of pests or infestations into your apartment as well. So I like to use an aeroid mix. I also get a lot of questions about what sort of plants can I use aeroid mix for? Well, it's for aeroids. So aeroids is pretty much everything you see behind me. And pretty much everything that you've ever seen on my account are aeroids. The only exceptions I can really think of in my collection is the oxalis, which is not an aeroid, Marantis, and my canna lilies. They're not aeroids. Everything else is aeroids. Monsteras, philodendron, alocasias, anthuriums, epipremnums, scindapsus. They're all aeroids. You can also easily tell by the size of their roots. Aeroids have very chunky roots. And these chunky roots like oxygen. They don't like to be in a medium that has no aeration and drainage. So I like to use an aeroid mix that is very chunky and well draining. So it has a lot of air pockets in there. And I achieve that by using very chunky materials. So chunky bark, chunky perlite, chunky pumice, and so on. I have a separate aeroid mix video on this as well. And what happens is when you water, all the water just drains through it really, really easily, really quickly. That does a couple of things. First of all, when you flush out the medium like that, you add oxygen into the pot. So that oxygen is vital for those roots. Second of all, it basically means that you can't overwater your mix. It's so well draining that not much water is actually retained within the mix itself. It all just flushes through it. What that means is that you have no risk of overwatering or very limited risk of overwatering, but you have a really high risk of underwatering. Now with my aeroids, I'm not worried about underwatering because I have most of them on moss poles and I keep the moss pole moist, and the moisture of the moss pole is just kind of keeping the potting medium at a consistent moisture level. But if you're somebody who doesn't have time to water your plants maybe weekly or so, then these specifically if you keep them in a small pot, then you might run risk of underwatering your plants and the roots dying due to lack of moisture. But the most common mistake indoors is really the fact that people overwater, which leads me to the next tip. Choose your right pot size, but don't overthink it. I think there is like there is a bit of a science to it. Ultimately, you want to choose a pot that suits the size of the root system, not necessarily the size of the plant, the size of the root system. But I think we are also overcomplicating and potentially trying to create a problem where there's not even a problem. I'm really only using 4 pot sizes, and the 4th pot size I only started adding this year. Up until this year, I got away with just using 3 pot sizes. I used 10 centimeters, those are these ones, and I use them when plants are still really small and I want to establish them. So it's a great pot size, for example, to chuck in my IKEA cabinet where the plants have perfect conditions and can really establish after going through some shock by being shipped here and so on. After that, I pot up a plant into a 14 centimeter pot. I think officially it's 13.8, but let's call it 14, who cares? That pot seems pretty small, but I managed to fit a small moss pole in it, and the plant can establish itself on that moss pole, and you can see that it slowly starts filling in the pot with some roots. I don't know if you can see that. I hope you can. I keep plants in that 14 centimeter pot probably for way too long, and I still haven't noticed any sort of issue. The main reason for that is that because I also use moss poles, the moss poles are vertical extension of the pot. So the size of the pot isn't so important because the plant has plenty of room vertically. If you don't use a moss pole, then obviously the size of your pot is more impactful in the sense of, well, it really determines the space that the roots have. Whereas if you have a moss pole, the moss pole determines the space that the roots have. But I like to keep my plants kind of pot bound. Couple of reasons for that. First of all, it means that I have less risk of overwatering because, well, there's just less medium in this pot that can retain moisture. Second of all, it saves space. And third of all, I'm not worried because I'm providing the plants with liquid nutrients weekly. So I'm not worried about the plant not having anything to feed on, despite the fact that it's in a pot with way too many roots for the amount of medium. But we talk about fertilizer in a second. After this pot, I pot them up to 20 centimeters. Look, and the reason I'm choosing these 3 pot sizes are because these are the only 3 pot sizes available in see-through. So there's no science to it. There's no like, ooh, this is the ideal pot size. It's honestly just what I've got available. So I potted up into after the 14 centimeter pot, I straight away switched to a 20 centimeter pot, which seems to be like quite a large jump, right? Normally, you could go from 14 to 16 to 18 to 20 and repot it all the time. But I haven't noticed any issues. Could also be because I keep it pretty root bound in the 14 centimeter pot. So by the time it gets to the 20 centimeter pot, it probably really needed it. But honestly, what I'm just trying to say is like, don't worry about it. Don't overthink it. As long as the pot is not extremely large compared to the size of the root system, your plant will be fine. Specifically, if you implement my tips in relation to your potting medium and having it really well draining and aerated, I don't think you really have to worry about the pot being too large. Of course, you don't want to have a little seedling in a 30 centimeter pot. But actually, I've seen people do that too, and they've had crazy success. But most of them live in very tropical countries where I just think the plants are just thriving and they don't care. But if you live in an environment that's already like suboptimal for these plants, you don't necessarily want to push it any further than you have to. So I get away with those 3 sizes up until this year, where my plants like this Adansonii over here have just become way too big. Also, I double, triple, quadruple plant some of my plants on poles, meaning that, you know, well, if I have 4 vines going up a pole, I have 4 times the root system. So I now started using 25 centimeter pots as well. I only have one for my Atabapuense, my Adansonii, my Dubia, and I think my Thai constellation. So I've only really started using those for plants that are that have started growing really large. The Thai constellation, for example, is much smaller than all of my other plants that are in this big pot, but because I didn't give the Thai constellation a moss pole, I needed to give it more room within the pot to grow roots. So the Thai constellation has got a large pot already, despite the fact that it's not even that large. Next tip, don't underestimate the importance of fertilizer. Now, it's probably the one thing that people, especially at the beginning, including me, aren't really doing consistently. I really only started fertilizing my plants 1 year into my plant journey. So the first year, I didn't really pay much attention to fertilizer. I was using store-bought potting mixes, and I suppose they come with a bit of fertilizer in there already. So I figured, whatever, I'll be fine. Once I started using proper fertilizer and good nutrients for my plants, I really saw a huge spike in growth. Like, think about it. Imagine you would only be giving water and sun, but no food. You also wouldn't be thriving. You wouldn't have a lot of energy. You wouldn't go out there and do things. So how's the plant supposed to make things happen? How's the plant supposed to grow and give you large leaves if you don't give it any food? I love talking about it, but I also hate talking about it. This is my fertilizer and it's an Australian brand. It's Growth Technology Australia Foliage Focus. I love using this and I've been using it for 2 years now and I have only positive things to say about it. Now, the only reason I hate talking about this is because it's not available overseas. I think they have expanded to a couple of countries like the Philippines, I think Canada, but overall, it's not really available overseas. It's an Australian product, and I think there are some issues with importing, exporting, and licenses and so on. So I can't really, I hate talking about it because I want to give you definitive answers. I want to be able to tell you, it's like, hey, use this product, it's really good. I can tell you that, but you can't get your hands on it. So it's kind of useless. But I'm assuming this is not a unique product. I mean, there's fertilizer companies out there. I'm sure they're all doing their research and making sure they produce a product that works for plants. That's literally their whole business model. So I would assume that most fertilizers really work. But I personally look for a mineral fertilizer. I do not like organic fertilizers. I don't like the smell of them. And when you're looking for mineral fertilizers, you want to look for mineral fertilizers that have complete minerals. Like, I think everybody just focuses on, what is it, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Anyway, there's these 3 that everybody focuses on. I believe there's actually 16 that a plant needs. So if you're just focusing on 3, it's basically like the human equivalent of focusing on protein, carbs, and fat, but you don't care about any of your vitamin, mineral intake, and so on. So you need to look after your macro and micronutrients as a person. So for your plants, you want to make sure that you give them all of the minerals that they need. So this GT Foliage Focus is a liquid mineral, and the good thing is that these minerals can be absorbed by the plant straight away and converted into plant growth. The main difference to organic fertilizer is that an organic fertilizer is really just providing certain nutrients to the potting medium, but it then relies on bacteria to break down these nutrients into the minerals that the plant can absorb, which means that if you're using an organic fertilizer but inorganic materials as your potting medium, it will never work because you didn't provide these bacteria in your potting, or there is no bacteria in your potting medium that can actually break down your fertilizer. So if you don't have access to GT Foliage Focus, I would recommend that you look in the hydroponic store for fertilizers. Just because they're sold in a hydroponic store doesn't mean that you can't use it with your organic material, with your organic medium. I mean, I'm using an organic medium. I use a mix of organic and inorganic materials. I use bark, for example, that's organic. I use perlite, that's inorganic. So I've created an aeroid mix that's a bit of both, but I want to provide my plants with a liquid nutrient. Specifically, where I keep the plant really root bound, it's important that the plant can easily absorb nutrients. So my fertilizer is a great solution, or the fertilizer is a reason why I can get away with growing plants in that aeroid mix in such small pots and just relying on that sustainable provision of nutrients with every watering or like weekly. I briefly mentioned timeframes earlier when I said to have realistic expectation, and I just really want to stress that this is not a race. You're not competing with anybody. You're on your own journey and you're growing your own plants. It's totally normal to get inspiration and motivation from other people online, but this is not a race. We're not competing for who's got the biggest plant and so on. Really, the whole idea behind this is to share your experiences and get inspired, but not get like so competitive that you kind of lose the whole passion for the hobby, if that makes sense. So just, you're running your own race. You're going to get there whenever you're going to get there. So make sure that you get inspiration and motivation from others, but don't let other people's success or other people's really fast growth discourage you. That doesn't make you any more or less of a plant parent, or any better or any worse of a plant parent. It might just be that they grow in completely different conditions that you can't match. There's nothing you can do but move countries, which is probably unrealistic. So don't worry about it. It's not a race. Enjoy the journey, enjoy your hobby, and do it in your own time. And my very last tip is that there are so many ways to get success. when you first start this hobby, you kind of feel like there must be a recipe, right? There must be a 10-step guide to success. Well, trust me, there isn't. You listen to one person online and they tell you do X, Y, Z, and then you talk to somebody else and they say do A, B, C. Now, who do you trust? Both of them just speak from experience. Both of them have great results. So it must be that both of them are right. So there isn't just one approach to plant care. There you can grow plants in a hydroponic setup. You can grow plants in a more organic setup. You can use a variety of different mediums. I mean, you can construct your moss poles in a billion different ways, right? There are so many ways to get to success later on. So don't get too caught up about trying to just follow exactly one step-by-step guide. There aren't any step-by-step guides. Understand the principles, understand the idea behind growing, understand the way that plants want to grow in nature, understand the signs that your plant gives up so you can understand whether your plant is happy or not, and then experiment a little bit, try different things, see what actually works for the plants that you have chosen and your environment. And don't get too caught up with, but X, Y, Z, you should be doing this. Don't care. Proof is in the pudding. The results speak much louder than words, and trust me, there's a lot of words out there and I'm contributing to it with this video. So whatever I also say, take it with a grain of salt. Just because it worked for me does not mean that it needs to work for you. Please, 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 anything that I say, apply critical thinking and think about whether this makes sense for your plants in your environment, or if that is just something that I can do in my environment because of certain factors that I don't have to deal with that you might, or the other way around. So just keep that in mind. We're all just speaking from experiences, and our experiences could all be very different, but we could still all end up having great success. Okay, I know that a lot of these tips were very conceptual and they were more in relation to like mindset rather than proper like do this, water this, and so on. And that's really because I can't give you very, very specific care tips that you can apply to any species in any environment that you want to grow at any time, right? So these are more conceptual, so they're applicable to everybody, and are really heavily focused on mindset, because I think once you're in the right mindset, any challenge that you'll be facing with your plants will just be easy, or will almost be an opportunity to learn, and you will grow from it and your plants will grow from it as well. Don't be discouraged by any setbacks. Have realistic expectation and really enjoy the journey, and I promise you that in a couple of years' time, you will be an expert at what you're doing with your plants in your environment. I think I said enough. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please click like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I'll see you in my next video. Thank you.